Welcome to the Smooth Brain Society podcast. Have you ever come across something and thought, I'm not smart enough for this? We think the fault lies with those who present information in ways which are hard to understand. In an attempt to change this, we'll be speaking to researchers, experts, and all-round wrinkly-brained individuals, improving our understanding of a broad range of topics which are rooted in psychology. Join us as we try to develop ourselves one brain fold at a time.
Please note that the Smooth Brain Society podcast is distinct from the Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. The views expressed on this show are those of our guests, presenters, and affiliates alone, and we assume no liability for the application of the information discussed. We also take no responsibility for any change in brain folds on part of the audience. Viewer discretion is advised. Now on to the podcast. Welcome back to the Smooth Brain Society. I am Sahid, and with me is Olivia.
Hello again.
Back after a little bit of a sabbatical.
Yep, bit of a break.
And today we will be talking mainly about rehabilitation in the criminal justice system, in focusing around New Zealand, but maybe we'll get some insight from our guest about places around the world as well. Our guest today is Dr. Roxy Heffernan. She has a PhD in forensic psychology from Victoria University of Wellington. She has worked with Ara Poutana Aotearoa, which is the Department of Corrections at New Zealand, in a range of roles, including rehabilitation program delivery of practitioner training, and support to the field itself. She has been involved in research since 2015, and her current research is working with the Department of Corrections around designing bicultural rehabilitation to help in improving outcomes for individuals in the justice system. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Heffernan.
Thank you both. That was a nice introduction. I thought I was going to have to say all that stuff, but that's much more succinct than what I would have said.
Was there anything that we missed that you want to mention?
Not really, no.
A few awards which you wanted to...
No, I don't think there's anything else I need to mention. Thank you.
All right, then. Every episode I start with a quote from a different language, which tries to encapsulate what we're talking about. And considering we were talking about rehab, I found this Japanese one, Nana Korobi Yaoki, which means fall 7 times, get up 8. Felt it would be your thoughts?
Yeah, no, good. That's a good quote.
Awesome. So shall we
begin? Can you give us a bit of a background into what forensic psychology is? And is it something that people often get confused with other areas of forensic science?
Yeah, so forensic psychology is essentially the intersection between psychology and the criminal justice system. So there are lots of different ways that psychology and psychological research is able to inform the goals of the justice system, which is essentially to keep the public safe and to stop people from committing more offences. So there are a lot of ways that psychology helps to inform this. So whether it's through research, through designing and delivering rehabilitation programs, through informing things like risk assessment, which help to manage risk in the community, informing decisions of the courts, even through to informing things like how people who work in these areas should be taking care of themselves. As you can imagine, being a lawyer or being a psychologist in the criminal justice area can be a pretty taxing job. So there are lots of ways that research can help us to enhance the working lives of people in the justice system, as well as the people who come into the care of Ara Poutana, the Department of Corrections. So essentially it's that area. It can get confused a little bit with, there's a bit of overlap sometimes with clinical psychology, because a lot of clinical psychologists also work for the Department of Corrections. They're the biggest employer of psychologists in Aotearoa. And also with criminology as well. So criminology is more about the society level sort of causes and solutions for crime, whereas the psychology aspect is focused more on individuals. So understanding why individuals act in ways that harm other people, why they commit different types of offences, and how we might intervene to predict and then influence them so that they don't harm any more people.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the factors that go into why some people offend?
Wow, that's a big question. That's a big question. And a lot of people have spent a lot of time researching this question. So the dominant, I guess, explanation for why people commit offences is that they throughout their development. So there's a combination of genetic or biological factors and also learned or environmental influences, which shape people's different capacities and different aspects of their life. So the idea is that throughout development, some people develop what we might call risk factors for committing offences. So those might be things like particular attitudes that people hold. It might be skill deficits in different areas. So some people might struggle to manage their emotions. They might struggle to use self-control, to think before they're acting. They might act quite impulsively in lots of different scenarios. They might have problems in their relationships with things like communication, being able to understand other people's mental states. One of the big risk factors is what we call antisocial personality pattern, which contains things like acting really impulsively, that kind of risky behaviour or sensation seeking, as well as sort of hostility and disregard for other people. And then we see things like substance use and, problems with education and employment and things like that as well. So all of those things collectively are risk factors for offending. So that's usually what we're focusing on when we assess someone's likelihood of committing another offence. And it's also what we focus on in interventions aimed at reducing some of these factors to reduce the likelihood that they'll offend again.
Yep. And what do some of those interventions look like? And something that I'm thinking about as well is it quite like a hopeful area? Like, are these interventions like quite effective in reducing reoffending?
Yeah, that's another great question. So start with what they look like. Internationally, actually, they look like usually group-based programs which focus on cognitive behavioural strategies. So the programs that we know work the best in terms of reducing reoffending tend to focus on cognitive behavioural sort of principles. So things like role play, Socratic questioning, so asking people about their thoughts and beliefs and highlighting some of those links between the way that they think and the way that they act, and then challenging some of the more antisocial ways of thinking. So, for example, things like thinking, I'm entitled to take what I want, or, I should be in control of my partner, I'm the man in the relationship, or things like violence is normal or violence is a useful way to deal with conflict, things like that. So you'd be questioning and sort of challenging some of those through discussion, and then sort of skills practice through role plays and things like thought diaries and practicing assertive communication skills rather than aggressive and things like that. So essentially they range in length. So one of the core principles of an effective program is that it is tailored towards someone's risk level. So people that we would say are in the highest risk band based on those risk factors and also on their history of offending. So those people would get much longer programs, much more intensive intervention than people with less risk factors or less history of offending. So, for example, in Aotearoa, we have, 6 special treatment units around the country, and those are for our higher risk people who are in prison. And those run from about 9 to 12 months, where they'll be in a group session, usually at least 4 days a week, and they'll have individual sessions with psychologists on top of that. So that's our most intensive. And then we've got a medium risk group of people who would usually get around sort of 2 to 4 months worth of intervention. So similar program, just less intensive, lower risk people. And then the people in the lowest risk band typically don't require any intervention at all. So research has shown that interventions can actually make people in this group worse rather than making them better. So we tend to direct our resources towards the higher risk people, the medium risk people, and then other people might receive things like vocational training or education and things like that while they're in prison. Mm-hmm. Perhaps treatment for substance use or something like that, but not a sort of intensive offence-focused or a focused on risk reduction program.
What do you think it doesn't work for that group?
There are a few reasons that it may not work. I think probably the most likely one would be if you sort of mix people from different risk levels, it can increase their risk through associating with peers who sort of hold more antisocial attitudes or are engaging in more sort of problematic behaviours, when perhaps actually they just need, they need better access to employment or education, or perhaps they need some treatment for substance abuse, but they don't have a lot of the sort of longer term patterns of behaviour or attitudes that other people in those groups might have. So they may pick them up from those people in the groups. We know that having pro-criminal associates and attitudes are two of the most predictive factors. So if you're constantly surrounded by people who are behaving in this way or speaking in this way, then I think the people who generally might be lower risk may pick up on some of that stuff.
And, sorry.
Go on.
And for those in the higher risk group, do they respond well to being in that group setting? Like, do they sort of enjoy being in an environment where they have peers of a similar background and experience?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's always a bit nerve-wracking. You can imagine asking a big tough guy in prison to come and start talking about his feelings in a group of people. It's not really the safest environment to be doing that kind of thing. I think a lot of people wouldn't feel comfortable doing that anyway. But in my experience, they do tend to sort of open up and really appreciate getting the perspectives of the other people in the group. Because if you can imagine myself going in there to deliver a program, when I was doing that, I was a Pākehā woman in my late 20s. What do I have in common with some of these men? Mm-hmm. Some things, and you're able to sort of pick up on those things. But in general, I think it's useful having people around you who've, grown up in a similar way to you, or perhaps are a similar age or a similar culture, or have more similar interests, or have been through some of the same things. And especially when you get a group with older guys and younger guys, you will notice the older guys sort of sharing some of the things that they've learned with the younger guys. And I think that means more than it coming from somebody who doesn't have a lot of those same experiences and doesn't have those same life experiences as them.
Have you found any particular common trends in your work with people in the high-risk group?
I worked mainly with the medium risk group when I was working in prison, yeah. What do you mean by trends?
In terms of, as you said, that you find like common grounds or things you associate with when talking to them, are there like any particular risk factors which you see which are very common?
In terms of risk factors, yeah, a lot of them would have the sort of the range of risk factors that we'd see. So generally you see attitudes because, they may not even be attitudes that they sort of held before they committed offences. But then once they're in prison and they're surrounded by this environment, things like trying to minimise what they've done, potentially sort of minimise their responsibility for their actions, or blaming the victim and things like that, I think can be quite common ways that we all try to sort of rationalise our own behaviour and minimise our own level of culpability for things. So I think it is normal in a sense to respond in some of those ways after we've been caught out doing something that we shouldn't do. So yeah, I think it's pretty common to see that kind of thing. Substance use, very, very common across a lot of the people that I've worked with. One thing that I've noticed, which I think I didn't expect when I started working with this group, is really quite high levels of insight into their own behaviour and sort of searching for ways to understand why they've done things that they've done. Like I think I didn't necessarily expect the levels of insight that I've seen, and also the levels of hope in terms of, them being able to really set goals for themselves and see a better future when, they're stuck in a place that isn't the most motivating and pleasant environment to be in. So, yeah, I was really impressed by the levels of insight and optimism, I guess, from a lot of people that I work with.
Yeah, do you think there are any or some big misconceptions that the general population has about those who are incarcerated?
Definitely. Yeah, I think there's a lot of misconceptions. I think one of the other things that I would say is most of the people that I've worked with, I genuinely think are pretty good people who are just trying to do the best that they can. Like there's not very many people that I've worked with who I would say I wouldn't want to talk to that person again, or I haven't, enjoyed learning about them and working with them and helping them. So I think there's a big stereotype around people who've been to prison, but actually they're not hugely different from the rest of us. They've just been through very different experiences than most of us have.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this works really well into the rehabilitation side of things, getting people from prison back into communities. Mm-hmm. Could you walk us through some of the steps taken by the Department of Corrections in it?
In reintegration?
Yep.
Yeah. I didn't have a lot to do with reintegration in my role, but I can talk about it a bit. So usually if somebody is eligible to do a program, usually they'll do that towards the end of, in prison, they'll do it towards the end of their prison sentence so that they're sort of ready to come out rather than sitting in there for a few years afterwards, forgetting some of the things that they've learnt before they come out. So typically they'll do a program, they'll do some maintenance, so they'll graduate from the program, they'll get a report which has feedback about progress that they've made in different areas and some suggestions for areas that they should continue to work on to continue to reduce their risk and to reach their other goals as well. And then they'll typically do what we call maintenance sessions, which are often usually fortnightly. Sometimes they can be a bit longer depending on how far out from release people are. But they'll come back to these sessions, which is kind of like an ongoing support group for people who've done a program. So often they'll be in that group with the people they've been through the whole program with, but sometimes it'll be a mix of different programs just depending on who's around. So they'll do that, and then once they're released, they'll continue to do more maintenance sessions. So once they're in the community, they'll have a probation officer. Their probation officer will meet with them. They'll explain the conditions of their sentence. So, for example, they might have a condition in there that they have to abstain from drugs and alcohol. They might have a condition that they can't associate with a particular gang or particular co-offenders, people that they've offended with in the past, or potential victims as well. So there might be, depending on their offence type, there might be restrictions on where they can live and what kinds of things they can do, and their probation officer will manage those conditions. And depending on their sentence, they might be on probation for 6 months, a year, or they might be on probation for the rest of their life if they've been given a life sentence, or if they have particularly serious offending that requires them to continue reporting in. But the frequency of reporting in also varies depending on the sentence given.
And what sort of things go into making that transition as smooth as possible? Because I've heard things like for people who have been in prison for quite a while, it can be quite daunting going out into the real world, or you don't have as many things that you're used to in prison, your normalities.
It can be quite daunting, especially if you've had a really long sentence and things have changed quite a bit. If you think about some of the changes in technology and things like that, we've got people in prison who've probably never had a cell phone, don't have an email address, don't have a CV potentially, lots of things that would be new to them. So it really varies based on location. And as I said, I don't have a lot of involvement in this area, but there are things like some people in prison will do what we call release to work, which is essentially they live inside the prison grounds, but they'll be able to leave during the day to go and work and come back. I guess it's really the role of probation, and there are some community organisations as well, depending on whereabouts in the country people are, who can support them with things like finding accommodation. They may still need rehabilitation. Not everybody gets what they need in prison for various reasons. Sometimes it's to do with sentence length or location or availability and things like that. So sometimes they might still need to do drug and alcohol counselling, or they might do some parenting classes, or they might even do a program in the community. Usually if someone's been in prison, they will complete that in prison because it is easier than doing it in the community. But there are still medium intensity programs that are delivered in the community as well as in the prison as well for people who don't end up getting a prison sentence. But essentially it's the probation officer's kind of their go-to person for linking them up with whatever it is that they need in terms of ongoing rehabilitation. And they also monitor risk across that time as well. So there's a risk assessment tool that's used in the community that probation officers will use every time they see somebody for a report in to sort of monitor how things are going.
Because you just spoke about risk increasing, are there separate rehabilitation programs for people who are repeated offenders?
Not necessarily. So having more offences does push your risk up. So it does. History of offending is one of the big risk factors, as well as all those kind of factors about the person. So often they will be higher risk if they have a long history of repeat offending, but also the offence type influences it as well. So if it's quite a serious violent or sexual offence, that person will be higher risk than somebody who has, let's say 3 driving offences or drug possession offences or something like that. The other thing I didn't say before as well is that there are separate programs for people who've committed sexual offences. We don't mix those offence types. So usually our medium intensity programs will be a mix of violent offences, property offences like burglary, and then your sort of more serious drug offences like manufacturing and distributing rather than possession. But the higher intensity programs in the special treatment units, those will mainly be violent offences because those are generally the people that are higher risk. But then we have 2 special treatment units, one down in Christchurch and one up in Auckland, for people convicted of sexual offences against children. So those are different. The risk factors for that type of offending is slightly different, and it's also safer to have those people grouped together separately.
Yeah. I'm interested in hearing more about the research that you've done and how that plays into the work that you do and what areas that you're really passionate about.
Sure. So my research has mainly, up until this year, mainly been theoretical research, which basically means it's not well understood, actually, and there's not that much of it happening. A lot of research in this area tends to be sort of empirical treatment outcome studies looking at rates of offending and things like that. But my research has mainly been theoretical, so it's largely looking at those risk factors that I talked about before, so things like pro-criminal attitudes, associates, personality pattern and things like that, and looking at the relationship between those factors and offending. Because in general, the theory in this area tends to be very sort of risk factor focused and not so much focused on sort of the person and their decision-making processes and their sort of the way that they engage with the world to get the things that they need. So a lot of my research has been shifting the focus of theories of offending from, risk factors cause offending to actually risk factors are, I guess, more symptom-like of problems that are going on for the person, and offending is also one of those symptom-like things. So it's instead developing theories based on human agency or goal-directed behaviour. So looking at all the different capacities that people need to be able to meet their needs in healthy and adaptive and pro-social ways, and then looking at where things might be going wrong when people are engaging in harmful behaviours like offending or substance use or anything else, really. Yeah, does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, that's really cool. So are there any specific types of offences which you look at with your theories?
A lot of the examples that I use are from the sexual offending against children area, just because there's a lot more theory in that space and there's sort of some unique risk factors there. But in general, because the theories that myself and my supervisor, Tony Ward, when I was doing my master's and PhD, the theories that we developed were focused on goal-directed behaviour. So actually there's no reason that it has to be any type of behaviour. The same theory of behaviour could be used to explain why someone commits a sexual offence, why someone commits a violent offence, why someone engages in behaviours like substance use or self-harm or whatever it might be. It's a general theory of a behaviour which can help to understand what different capacities or psychological mechanisms are involved in, engaging in behaviours to meet our needs and then what's going wrong. Because a lot of the time what we find is that the risk factors for different behaviours are quite similar, particularly ones like emotional dysregulation or problems with managing emotions. Actually, you see those across a range of offence types, whether the behaviour is sexual or violent, or we also know that that's sort of plays into behaviours like substance use and self-harm and things like that as well. So I guess what we noticed is that a lot of the time the risk factors can look the same, but the behaviour that's chosen by that person can be quite different. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to just focus theory on one particular behaviour. I think there's a place for that, but there's also a place for having more general theories of goal-directed behaviour that can help us to formulate and understand what's going on for that person. So I was able to bring that a little bit into my work when I was designing programs and designing like assessment process for people coming into programs. So the idea was that using theories that were geared towards understanding people's motivation, why they're engaging in the behaviour, how they made that decision, and then looking at where things have gone wrong, that might be more useful than simply focusing on those areas of risk and setting goals against those. So I was able to bring that in there as a formulation sort of template for people to understand what's happening when someone commits an offence. So whether the problem seems to be that actually they've got these long-standing beliefs about themselves and others in the world. So, for example, common ones, I mentioned a couple before, but things like the world is dangerous, other people are out to get me, I'm a victim, I have to get others before they get me. So that way of seeing the world is pretty common, and that's obviously going to influence the sorts of behaviours that people engage in if they're trying to, for example, if they're trying to keep their partner in a relationship with them and that's their way of seeing the world, their response in that situation might be quite different from if they had a really sort of healthy view of themselves and relationships and, you know, generally expectations that other people are to be trusted and that they can, they can work things through by communicating rather than using things like intimidation or violence and different things. So that's one area that could be risky. You can always also look at things like what is the influence of other people on the goal-directed behaviour here. So thinking about what other people were present when people commit offences. So sometimes people might only commit offences in the presence of other people that are in the same gang as them. That can help us to understand where some of those barriers to more goal-directed ways of meeting their needs might be. Was that just a massive tangent?
No, that's really interesting. I think that way of conceptualizing it sounds quite like empowering and less sort of like external, like observing why someone's doing something, but rather sort of, getting into their head as to why they're doing something and understanding them a bit better.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because it's a more strength-based approach. So one thing that might be, if I can do it really succinctly, good to explain here is that there's generally a sort of a dominant approach to rehabilitations based on a lot of North American research from the 80s through the 90s. So throughout those decades, there was a real push to getting evidence for rehabilitation. Prior to that, in the 70s, there was a real sort of pessimism about, does programs work? Should we just throw people in prison? But what came out of that was no, actually, punishment makes people worse. So we know punishment, people who go to prison are more likely to, everything else being equal, are more likely to reoffend than some people who don't go to prison. So rehabilitation has to work over and above that to be successful, and it generally does. So this body of work sort of looked at lots of different treatment outcome studies, did a lot of meta-analyses, and came up with some principles for what's the most effective. Those principles are the one about allocating by risk level that I talked about before. The second one is targeting those areas of risk. So quite risk-focused, those first two principles. It's about risk level, then it's about targeting risk factors, those predictive factors in treatment. And then the third core principle of that model is around being responsive to, first of all, the evidence, which shows that cognitive behavioural interventions tend to have the biggest impact on reducing reoffending, and then the specific responsivity aspect, which is about being responsive to the people in the population that you're working with. So, for example, that could be differences due to gender, culture, age. So we have different programs for younger people, different programs for women, different programs for men, sometimes for offence types, depending on the location. So sometimes there'll be specific domestic violence programs, specific programs for sexual offending, but also things like learning style and potential disabilities and things like that as well. We have to, when we're assessing people, we really look at, what is their capacity to engage in this? Are there issues with literacy? Because there are some sort of written aspects and workbook stuff in programs, or do we need to adapt some of the activities to be a bit more active rather than sitting around talking for 2 hours, particularly with youth? They don't want to sit in a room for 2 hours talking about things. They want to do activities and get out of the room and things like that. So that's the specific responsivity principle. It's about tailoring what you're doing to the people you're working with. So that's the sort of the dominant approach that's typically used. There are other principles, but I won't get into that because there's too many. And then in the early 2000s, Tony Ward, who's a professor here at Victoria, and was my supervisor, so he designed a model called the Good Lives model. So the Good Lives model came along and said, in a nutshell, we think this is too risk focused. What about what people want? What about their well-being? Are people going to be motivated by the possibility of just reducing their risk, or does there need to be something more for them to look for in order to motivate them to live more fulfilling and offence-free lives? So the idea is that these two models can work together. They don't need to be opposing, but they are often pitched as opposing. Yeah, so the approach that I was talking about, the sort of the agency-based or goal-directed behaviour-based theories fit really nicely with the Good Lives model, because the Good Lives model is all about, offending is about, people trying to meet the same needs that we're all trying to meet. So we all want intimacy in relationships. We all want mastery, to feel like we're doing well at work and we're doing well in other things that are important to us, whether that's sport or music or whatever it is. We all want inner peace. We all want, to be able to live a healthy life where we have shelter and food and basic needs that everybody wants. The idea is that when people are lacking in some of the internal and external resources, and I'll explain what those are in a moment, then they sort of resort to other strategies which can be more harmful, both for them and for other people as well. So internal resources, we're talking about things like problem-solving skills, emotion management skills, communication skills, our ability to relate to others and understand others' mental states. And then external resources, we're talking about things like opportunities. So we know the world is not equal for everybody. We know some people have more access to things like education and employment and financial assistance and anything, I guess, based on what's available where they are, but also who they are in that space as well.
Yeah, that sounded really humanising, I think, when you're talking about the Good Lives model, that we all are sort of wanting the same things like intimacy and mastery.
Yeah, and I think it helps when you're working with people to think about them that way. It helps you to remove that judgment and to go, okay, that person's looking for these things. Those are totally normal things to want for whatever reason. That's our jobs, really, is to work out that reason. They've tried to get those things by taking from other people or from hurting other people. And, given a similar background and learning experiences and life events, perhaps we would all respond in that way in that situation. You don't know because you've not lived that person's life. So I think it can be quite a humbling thing and quite a good way to suspend any sort of judgment, I guess, when you just sort of understand we're all just trying to do the best that we can. And if we can work out what it is for that person that's getting in the way, and again, it's similar to those things I was talking about before, it's their way of seeing the world, or it's the fact that they don't have the skills to communicate what they want properly, so they resort to violence, or perhaps they just really struggle with managing their emotions, so they're constantly using substances, which is then getting in their way of their relationships, their ability to hold down a job, and so then they're in resort to, selling substances or whatever it might be. Yeah, it's all of those same things, but it's about understanding for that person, how does that actually get in the way of what it is that they want to live a good life, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also don't really see how the two models are opposing or seen as opposing, because I guess the risk factors would come under the certain things which are preventing someone from...
Yeah, totally. I think the misunderstanding that they're opposing is generally, it's probably based on really early sort of writings about the model when it was first starting to be developed. And I guess the two misconceptions, I think, are that if you're using the Good Lives model, you should not worry about it's called the R&R, or the risk-need-responsivity model, and that you should not worry about risk. So the criticism there, I guess, is that if we just focus on people's well-being, we might just end up with really happy criminals. Which, I don't know, maybe we would. But the Good Lives model doesn't say let's not worry about risk. It says let's conceptualise these factors as barriers that are getting in the way here. They're not necessarily the causes of behaviour. There's lots of other things going on in terms of, motivation, how people make sense of the world, how they learn from their behaviour, things like that. But yeah, I think it's the kind of the misconception that it's risk or well-being that we should be concerned about, whereas actually we should be concerned about both, but coming from the really strong kind of statistical evidence sort of background that the Canadian model does, it really doesn't leave a lot of space for things that are slightly harder to measure or don't have a lot of evidence for them. So the evidence base for the Canadian model is very strong. It's been, they've been looking at treatment outcome studies since the late 70s, early 80s, whereas the Good Lives model is newer and it's a to be used alongside kind of model. So there's a reluctance, I think, sometimes to use models that have less evidence for them if it feels like you're giving up something with the other model. But my argument would be that you don't actually need to give up anything.
That works really well into me asking, are there different, because you mentioned the Canadian model, are there any differences between different nations and their models which you think New Zealand can learn from?
That's a really good question. I think the Canadian model, the risk-need-responsivity Canadian model, is used pretty much everywhere. I don't know of any countries that don't use it because it's the biggest body of evidence that we have. And so we obviously need to be taking that into account when we're designing interventions and things like that. The Good Lives model, interestingly, has been used internationally more than it's been used here until quite recently. So it's used reasonably widely in the US, the UK, probably Australia as well. It was used in our youth programs, which is interesting, but not so much in our adult programs until quite recently. So the other thing that's probably worth mentioning is that there has recently been a bit of a shift from, if you've seen the Department of Corrections strategies that they come out with every few years, the last one was creating lasting change, reducing reoffending by 25% by, I think it was 2017. But the current strategy, Hokairangi, is a whole-of-department strategy that is really strongly focused on reducing offending and increasing wellbeing for Māori within the criminal justice system. So previously there had been Māori-specific strategies, but not a whole-of-department strategy that was really focused on reducing the overrepresentation of Māori in the justice system. And so one of the 6 sort of principles within this strategy is humanising and healing. So really shifting from that, we want to reduce reoffending, that's the goal of the justice system, to we do want to reduce reoffending. Obviously, we want to keep the community safe and we want to reduce harm, but we also want to increase the oranga or well-being of particularly Māori within the justice system and their whānau. So taking a more holistic, humanising, healing, and I guess collective approach to reducing offending and increasing wellbeing rather than just the one. So that's really interesting, and I think that's partly why there's been a shift in recent years to bringing in more strength-based models like the Good Lives model, and also incorporating more Māori models and content into programs than has been done before.
Yeah, that sounds like a super interesting area, and it sounds like tailoring to cultural specifics sounds really important.
Yeah, it is, and that's one of the things that can be quite challenging when you're relying on a lot of research from overseas, is that, we have quite a unique context here. Not that Canada doesn't also have a history of colonisation and things like that, but we have quite a unique population here. We have a history of colonisation and the downstream effects of that have led us to this position where we see Māori disproportionately affected as victims of crime, as well as overrepresented within prison and community sentences as well. And, that's alongside a bunch of other statistics that we know where Māori are impacted disproportionately. So we do have a unique context here. I think rehabilitation programs have always incorporated Māori knowledge to some extent, but I think there's a real push now to let's actually elevate that to the same level as psychology, which is challenging because there's not as much research on Māori models. If we're looking at psychology, we can draw from research that's been done everywhere in the world, but if we're looking for evidence, depending on how we're defining evidence, that Māori models work to reduce reoffending, we have to be using them to find that evidence. And so, yeah, it's a real kind of chicken and egg situation where it's sort of, we're trying to do evidence-based practice, but if we flip that on its head and we think about practice-based evidence, we have to do the practice to get the evidence. And so if we don't change, or integrate and elevate the Māori models and tikanga Māori within the programs, then we're not going to have any evidence for whether or not those work.
I was going to ask, do you think being in a position like being non-Pākehā, like the cultural majority, does that affect the internal and external resources that you have, that what you were talking about before?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely cultural differences. We know there's bias in the justice system as a whole. There's been research on that. We know that Māori students have less access to education, less likely to finish high school. And we know that some of those are due to different biases in both the way we educate and I guess how we interact with each other. So yeah, I think absolutely things like areas of risk like education and employment are really big ones where there's not, as much as we'd love to think that there are the same access to these things, there isn't.
Mm-hmm. Are there any steps you think that the Department of Corrections or the government should take in order to help with that? Because you're kind of trying to change societal perspectives, aren't you?
Yeah, do you mean around changing attitudes?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think, I don't have experience with this, so I can't comment on it too much, but I think there are a lot of government agencies that these people come into contact with, so often the same people who are managed by corrections will also have contact with oranga tamariki, with potentially social workers, counsellors, lots of different services. So I think there may be a way in the future to sort of integrate that a lot more holistically so that, information is shared and things run a lot more smoothly. But in terms of changing public attitudes, I think that's super, super important. There is some evidence that education can work in shifting public attitudes, but also the emotional component of attitudes, which is kind of that fear or disgust, depending on the offence type, is a lot harder to shift through education. So people can learn new things about, the causes of offending or the likelihood that someone would offend, and that might change their belief about that, but it might not necessarily shift the fact that they still wouldn't want them living next to them or wouldn't give them a job and that kind of thing. One of the things that has been found to have a positive effect on that is having sort of real face-to-face experience with someone who's lived through that, or perhaps someone who has committed a particular type of offence can talk about the different things that led to that, what happened, and then sort of how they've changed things after that and some of those barriers that they then experience. So often having that, I guess it's sort of real-world experience or knowing a person who fits that group can sort of reduce those stereotypes of that you generally, I guess, get from things like the media and those crime documentaries that we all like to watch. We know that people who offend are not one group of people with one particular problem. They're all different. And I think some of those stereotypes, I think, can be eroded a bit if we get to know the individuals who belong to those categories. Because if we think about categories like sex offender, that immediately conjures up a particular type of person, which actually probably most people who've committed an offence of that category wouldn't fit that stereotype. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I don't know. Don't know how to do it.
Yeah, that's really hard because I imagine the people you'd most want to get to listen to these people's lived experiences really don't want to listen to it.
Yeah. I think actually what I have seen recently is an increase in documentaries that are a bit more sympathetic in terms of, and a bit more realistic. We've all seen the crime documentaries that are very sensationalized and, oh my God, this happened and then this evil person did this, which is not really a helpful way to talk about anyone. But I have noticed in recent years often through various film festivals and things, there has been some documentaries coming out, particularly from the US, particularly from Florida. I know there's at least a couple that I've seen that were made in Florida around public attitudes towards people who commit sexual offences and how that can kind of influence things like legislation. Like in Florida, they have some very, very restrictive and quite punitive strategies going on there for managing risk in the communities. And often what that leads to is people not being able to live in most of the different areas that they would be able to live in. So they can't access treatment, they can't get accommodation, so they're living in these little sort of trailer parks together, all with people who've committed sexual offences, or living in tents just outside of the barrier that they're not allowed to live inside and things like that. And actually we know all of those things increase risk of reoffending. So there has been some, one of them is called Untouchable. If people are interested, I think that was made in 2017, 16 or 17 maybe. It's a really good documentary. And the other one is called, it might be Pervert Park, I think. But they're both, quite eye-opening, show the impact of some of these policies, which particularly in Florida for some reason, but in the States they have enacted. We don't have those same policies here, luckily. Like they have community notification and a public register of people who have committed sexual offences. So often that encourages things like vigilante justice and just pretty severe isolation from the community, which is a risk factor for sexual offending. So, all of these policies that I guess come from an emotional place and are wanting to protect people and punish people place are actually inadvertently increasing the risk of what we don't want to happen. So, I think through watching documentaries like that, the public might change their views on some things, but yeah.
Because we spoke about America, colloquially I've heard that the Scandinavian prison system models are really good. Would you be able to comment on those?
Not in any great depth, no. It's an interesting thing, actually. A lot of the time we don't really know what other countries are doing unless you kind of put in a request to their, whatever their corrections is over there, to sort of ask about their programs. Often it's not, like in the research, for example, it's not really described in any great depth what people are doing. I know just based on things that I've heard about that part of the world, they do use strength-based models like the Good Lives model. And I think just in terms of their actual prison structures and things, they're a lot less punitive and they're a lot more rehabilitative. So people will have more freedom. They won't spend as many hours locked in a cell, which can only be good for their rehabilitation. So I think, again, it varies across countries as well. There are particular, especially countries that are divided up into states, like Australia or the US, prisons can do quite different things. So, for example, some prisons, newer prisons, are set up in a much more rehabilitative way.
Mm-hmm. I have a really basic question, and I probably should have asked it earlier, but why does punishment not work?
That's a good question. Because you would think that it might, right? Especially given what we know from psychology as well. I think the main reasons that punishment doesn't work in this context is that it's not immediate. We know punishment works best when it's immediate and when it's consistent, and it's not either of those things in the justice system. So people might not get caught for something till a long time afterwards. People also won't get caught every time they do something, especially for lower level offending. They might get detected every 20 times that they sell a drug or drive while under the influence and things like that. So it's definitely not consistent. It's not immediate. And I think the other thing is just what I talked about before, that it increases risk because you've taken away a lot of the things that would be protective to a person. So you've removed them from their social relationships, you've removed them from, they may have had employment, accommodation. So all of the things that they've lost when they've been sent to prison, they have to then try and get back to that level when they get out. So prison might contain the risk for a lot of people. There might be less opportunities for them to offend, not none, but less. But then once they're back in society, they're back there with a whole new set of barriers that they didn't have last time in terms of accommodation, employment, relationships, a lot of people in prison have children, and just removing them from them can do a lot of sort of damage as well, and can have an impact on the way people think about themselves and the world and that kind of thing as well. So lots of different reasons that it doesn't work.
And do you think that everyone deserves an equal chance or an equal chance at rehabilitation? Because there'd be some people who would be, victims or of these crimes, or victims' families that would say, oh no, they don't deserve all these things.
I think everybody deserves equal access to rehabilitation. Not everybody wants rehabilitation, or not everybody wants the rehabilitation that's being offered to them. There are lots of different pathways to assistance or to living a healthy pro-social life. Rehabilitation is just one thing that can help on that pathway. So there are people who don't want to offend again, but also don't want to engage in rehabilitation. But in terms of deserve, I think that's it's a moral judgment, and it really depends what our aim is. If we want to punish someone, then sure, we might decide that they don't deserve it. But if we want for community safety and to prevent victimisation, then we need to offer them access to rehabilitation. And the other thing I would add to that is that most, I can't put a number on it, but a majority of people that I have worked with have also been victims of various types of crime, and often not just once. So I would say actually there's a need for a dual focus on rehabilitation to change people's ways of thinking and their behaviour in order to prevent them from reoffending. But at the same time, I think for a lot of people there is a need for rehabilitation in terms of dealing with things like trauma and historical abuse and things like that. And people in prison can get access to counselling for trauma and things like that, just like people can in the community. But I'd say there's a big need for that alongside the offence-focused stuff as well. And those two things can possibly work together as well. Well, you asked before, Olivia, about whether it was hopeful in terms of does rehabilitation actually work. Mm-hmm. So we could maybe end on that. So, it does tend to work, is the short answer. It's a really tricky question to answer because obviously there are loads of things that will impact whether or not it does work, and it's quite hard to isolate the effects of a rehabilitation program that someone might attend for 10 hours a week from everything else that's going on in their life. And also, as I said before, rehabilitation programs have to work over and above, in prison anyway, they have to work over and above the increase in risk that happens just from being in prison. But yes, we do tend to find internationally as well, but here in Aotearoa, every year we look at doing a comparison of people who've completed different programs and then been released, and then follow up for 12 months to look at their rates of reoffending. And we find that all of those tend to be in the right direction in terms of people who've done the program reoffend at lower rates. And so often the more intensive ones with the higher risk people have the biggest effect, which is what we'd expect really, because they have the biggest opportunity to have an effect because the people who are there are higher risk. So when those people are matched with people who are higher risk who don't have that intervention, we find that the people who had it reoffended a much lower rate. Yeah, but obviously it's complicated because there are lots of different things that go into making a program, lots of different, activities or skills that people can build in programs, and it's very hard to sort of isolate that and say, well, what is working about this program? Because the programs here aren't exactly the same as the programs anywhere else. And the programs here aren't all exactly the same as each other either. So I think it's one thing to know, yes, in general, things are optimistic. They are working. We should continue investing in them. But at the same time, in my opinion, what we now need to do is more work to understand what about them is working for people, and are different things working for different people. And as I was talking about before, to also elevate the use of mātauranga Māori in these programs so that we are able to be responsive to it and cater to a really large group of people who engage in our programs.
So what would you like to see in programs in, 10, 20, 30 years? What would that look like, ideally?
If I knew that, I wouldn't need to do most of my research. I guess I'd like to see what I'm starting to see, which is why I'm really encouraged with what's happening at the moment in terms of the newer strategy and the direction that programs are going in. So I'd like to see more sort of strength-based humanising language, which we've definitely seen a shift in the last few years, removing words like offender from program titles and things like that, and just shifting the way that we talk about people, being more trauma-informed, more humanising and healing. And then also I'd like to see a more equitable balance of Māori content in our program and a real uplift in capability in staff, I think, and recruitment of more Māori practitioners would be a really great start as well. But those are all things that I'm already starting to see. I guess I'm just hoping that they look even better in 20 years.
Awesome.
Amazing.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Before you go, we have one last set of questions we need to ask you. These are just a few rapid fire questions which we ask all our guests.
Yeah.
So if you're ready, just Olivia will start asking them, and just the first answer which comes to mind.
Cool.
Yep. Summer or winter?
Summer, definitely.
Movie or TV series?
TV series.
If your life were a TV series, what genre would it belong to?
Crime.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Morning, noon, or night?
Night.
Outdoors or indoors?
Indoors.
Cats or dogs?
Cats.
What's your weapon of choice?
My brain.
That's a good answer. Yeah.
It's probably not true, but...
Which superpower would you like to have?
I'd like to be able to teleport so I didn't have to spend time travelling anywhere.
True. Is a hot dog a sandwich?
No.
Oh.
So he is disappointed.
Sorry.
What is your least favourite type of music?
Country?
What is your favourite food or cuisine?
Burgers.
What is the ugliest fruit or vegetable?
Brussels sprout.
Oh, yeah.
If you could be any animal, what would it be?
Monkey. They're very cute and they're good at climbing trees.
What is the worst thing you've paid money for?
I don't know. I went to an art gallery on the weekend that was terrible.
Oh, really?
But I'd rather not say which one.
Oh, it depends. It differs on what you define as terrible in terms of art.
I don't
It's in the
understand
eye of the beholder.
Yeah, I don't understand how anyone could have enjoyed this. It looked like a 5-year-old could have done it. But it wasn't overly expensive, so it was fine. It just comes to memory because it was very recent.
Yeah.
But probably a lot of things.
Yeah.
If you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be?
Oh, this is a tough one. Probably here.
Yeah.
Because I think I would live somewhere else if I wanted to. I don't know, you might hear that I've moved soon because I've reconsidered that question.
Oh, yeah.
What quote or saying do people say which you think is complete bullshit?
Oh, I thought you were going to ask for a good one, and I was like, oh, I can think of a good one. No, you might have to edit something in for that one, or edit it out.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, these
Well, you
ones
can
are-
say your good quote.
Yeah, what's a good one which you have then?
Oh, I like an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Because I just think, yeah, like we were talking about before, I think people can get very emotional about things, which is understandable. But if we try and, punish and hurt people just because they've hurt us, we're going to end up in a much worse situation.
What's legal but still feels illegal?
This might be a controversial one, but I think infidelity feels like it should be illegal.
Mm-hmm.
Not speaking from personal experience or anything, but it's one of those things that, or catfishing or something like that, where it's like quite clearly harmful for one person by another person, but it's not illegal. Whereas physically hurting someone is, but that kind of emotional trauma, I guess, isn't.
Yeah, because it can cause a great amount of distress.
Mm.
Yeah.
But even with things like catfishing, it's only when there's sums of money involved that anything can be done legally when it's just like emotional damage. Yeah, it's legal.
Yeah.
I didn't think of that one.
Yeah.
If you were not doing this, as in this line of work, what would you be doing?
I would be writing novels. They would probably have something to do with crime.
Oh, yeah.
So not too different. Or I would own a vineyard. Not that I think I'd be that great at making wine, but seems like a nice peaceful lifestyle.
Yeah.
Are you good at drinking wine?
Yes.
A great skill.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. The last question is, if you could leave us with any piece of advice, what would it be?
I guess seek to understand why people might do the things they do and give people the benefit of the doubt rather than jumping to judgment. Because I think that would help shift the way that we treat people in the criminal justice system. But it also, I think, makes us feel better when we don't, jump to judgment and condemnation rather than understanding.
That's great advice.
Thanks for all that. One last thing. If people wanted to get in contact with you, how would they be able to do that?
Probably through my staff page on the university website would be the easiest way. That's got my email address and everything on it.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for coming on again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Roxy. That was so much fun. And yeah, thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, all those social medias at The Smooth Brain Society. And yeah, until then, don't jump to conclusions. Don't be quick with your judgment of people.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Bye.